Virginia's geography was once dominated by plantations. Comprising thousands of acres, hundreds of them stretched across the Commonwealth, from the eastern shore to the Appalachian Mountains. Many of them are now little more than memories, like Rosewell in Gloucester County, once the most impressive house in British North America. About 40 of Virginia's plantations still survive in a functional state. One of the most uniquely magnificent of them all is Berry Hill in Halifax County. Berry Hill tells the story of one of Virginia's most powerful aristocratic families, as much as the hundreds of enslaved people whose toil made this world possible for the privileged few. Places like this are rare in the 21st century, and rarer still the opportunities they afford to immerse ourselves in the dramatic splendor and the painful gravity of our shared past. A plantation has existed here since the reign of King George II, when William Byrd II was gifted a generous royal land grant for his work in mapping the colonial border between Virginia and North Carolina. The first plantation house known to exist on this site was known to have been built around 1745. No contemporary descriptions of the house exist, but archaeological evidence and tax records indicate that the house was built of brick and was 1.5 or 2 stories in height. Stately but simple, it would have resembled most early federal or colonial-style plantations in Virginia, like Patrick Henry's home of Scotchtown in Hanover. The first slaves were brought to Berry Hill in 1802. At that time, there were over 340,000 enslaved people in Virginia, well over a third of the Commonwealth's total population. In 1841, James Coles Bruce acquired this 2,000-acre plantation, along with 47 enslaved people from Edward Carrington, in repayment for a debt owed to his late father's estate. The Carrington house was too small for the Bruces and their sprawling family. James and his wife Eliza, in need of space and desiring a suitable expression of their wealth and status, decided to knock down the Carrington house and build anew. Inspiration came from the Bruces' close friend, Nicholas Biddle, director of the Second Bank of the United States. Berry Hill would be a larger and more refined version of Biddle's striking Greek Revival home, Andalusia, just north of Philadelphia, and all but certainly drew inspiration from the bank itself. Construction began in 1842 under the watchful eye of noted Virginia builder Josiah Dabbs, fresh off of building the new Mecklenburg County Courthouse, and architect John Evans Johnson, who trained in civil engineering at West Point. The home's exterior walls were brick, which was stuccoed and painted to resemble granite. Brickwork on the rear wall of the main house was left exposed, owing to James Bruce's relative frugality. Dabbs oversaw the assembly of the massive rafters spanning the 68-foot width of the house, the largest members of which were felled and hewn on site. Most of the granite blocks for the portico and steps, as well as those trimming the door and window openings, was quarried from a ravine a quarter-mile northwest of the building site. Dabbs was also contracted to build a number of support buildings around the house, most of which still stand today. 2 of the old Carrington House's outbuildings dating from around 1770 were kept and refaced in Doric facades to match the new Berry Hill house. One served as a plantation office, and the other as a billiard room. For a brief time, one of the small temples was also used as a school for the Bruce children. The overseer's house near the main gate was also kept, where visitors would stop to request permission before proceeding down the half-mile-long driveway. Dating from 1816, it is among the oldest of the plantation's outbuildings. After 18 months of construction, the Bruces had settled into the commanding Greek temple at Berry Hill by Christmas 1843. Josiah Dabbs was paid just shy of $27,000 for his work, a little more than $1.1 million in today's value. In fact, the Bruces were so pleased with Dabb's work that he would later be contracted to build other family properties, including the plantation houses at Terover, Wilburn, and the Gothic masterpiece, Stanton Hill. Sheer scale alone made Berry Hill one of the Commonwealth's most extravagant houses, but this was the purest example of domestic Greek Revival architecture in Virginia. In that realm, only the much smaller Arlington, built by the step-grandson of George Washington in 1817, compares in either taste or size. Dwarfing Berry Hill House was its garden, some 6 acres whose principal pathways were 16 feet wide. Cultivated to Eliza's exacting standards, the terraced garden was in constant bloom during spring and summer. Berry Hill's interior was equally as impressive as its exterior. The mansion's design showpiece was a mahogany staircase, with twin flights curving outward from a central landing. Like any noteworthy craftsman, Dabbs replicated his best work. He would install a more modest version of this staircase when building South Isle in Charlotte County some years later, and an even grander version in Stanton Hill in the 1850s. Marble baseboards and mantels in the double parlor were said to have come from the same quarry that supplied the marble for Michelangelo's statue of David. Silver-plated doorknobs and hardware complemented the legendary Bruce family silver collection, which even included silver washstands for every bedchamber. Nearly 15,000 square feet contained parlors, bedchambers, workrooms, and a purpose-built nursery for the expansive Bruce issue. On many nights, Eliza wandered these drafty rooms, soothing at least one restless newborn. Like every plantation house in the antebellum South, Berry Hill was designed to be supported by a small army of enslaved people. From the enslaved laborers utilized during construction, to the domestic staff who cleaned and served the household, slave labor was the engine that birthed and maintained Berry Hill. No fewer than 108 enslaved people lived and worked here in the Bruce's time. Slave families were each given a stone cottage to live in. It is difficult to imagine an entire family living in these small, 2-room houses. Nevertheless, even this was far better than the average enslaved person could expect at that time on most other plantations. A life of bondage was a grueling existence. Tilling and planting hundreds of acres of corn, cotton, wheat, and tobacco, with virtually no mechanization, was back-breaking work. In addition to cash crops, the plantation had to ensure that enough vegetables, meat, and dairy products were produced to feed this self-reliant community, sometimes called Berry Hill Town. Domestic service for the 32 enslaved people who worked inside the main house was no less busy. The nucleus of their domain was the service wing connected to the rear of the house, which contained the kitchen, pantry, and laundry, as well as a privy. Bells in the rear hallway were wired to switches in each room of the main house by means of copper wires concealed behind the baseboards. Each bell rang with a distinctive tone to indicate to which room service was summoned. Domestic slaves navigated the main house through the back staircases and hallways, common features in great country houses in Europe and North America by the mid-19th century. Architecture echoed the ideology of race and class division by keeping those who served out of sight and out of mind of those whom they served. Even louvers were installed on the colonnade outside the dining room windows to conceal the plantation's other world from those at the dining room table. Deep in the woods lies Diamond Hill Cemetery, where many of the plantation's enslaved people came to rest after a lifetime of toil. It is one of the largest slave cemeteries in Virginia, with nearly 300 known burials. There are no inscribed headstones here, only the occasional fieldstone to mark the head of a handful of graves. This humble cemetery is a testament to the people who brought Berry Hill to life. They include Darby Duncan, Berry Hill's talented chef, who studied in Louisiana and passed his skills on to his son. Busy, the Bruce family's meticulous housekeeper. And not least of all, Alec Pamplin, the devoted butler who was also a preacher and lived in his own cottage by the pond. A monument dedicated in the summer of 2022 acknowledges the legacy of the enslaved people who were held in bondage at Berry Hill, many whose names and individual stories history has long since forgotten. Deeply rooted religious, economic, and social forces in the antebellum South reinforced this world of extreme inequality, both between and within races. Few people among the Southern aristocracy ever seriously questioned the status quo from which they benefited. Eliza Bruce herself was no revolutionary when it came to questions of race or class. She was, however, one of the few women in this time and place who was keenly aware of the world around her. One of Eliza's letters, held in the archives at the University of Virginia, detail a visit from one member of the community in the spring of 1845, who forced Eliza to reflect on her privilege in a way that perhaps no one else ever had.
Mrs. Grogan had a long account of her trials and afflictions. I felt for her most sincerely, for although she may be cross, yet I have no doubt she is poor. I gave her some necessaries, and I hope they may be of use to her. She walked here 6 miles. When the poor creature comes begging, I always feel so humbled, for I cannot help thinking, why has God made my lot so different from theirs? Certainly not because I deserve it.
Around this same time, an enslaved man at Berry Hill named Edgar tested James and Eliza's tolerance. History does not relate what Edgar may have done, or whether he was truly guilty. What is clear is that the Bruce's punishment was, for them, unusual and definitive. Edgar was sold. After his sale from Berry Hill, Edgar disappears from the historical record. His family probably never heard from him again. Slavery at its core was a system defined by power, specifically who held that power, and what they were willing to do in order to preserve it. No amount of power could exempt even the Bruces from all of life's cruelty. Rather than a happy family home, the new Berry Hill had instead become a temple to sadness, as death claimed 7 of the Bruces' 11 children. The creative spark within Eliza that dreamed up this place gradually dissolved as one child after another slipped away. Berry Hill's heartbroken matriarch lapsed into eternity before her own time. Eliza died of tuberculosis in 1850 at just 40 years of age. She was buried with her children in the cemetery below the terraced garden she designed. Prostrate with grief, James visited his wife's grave constantly. Years later, he would remark that he knew the dead never came back to earth. For had it been possible, he was sure that Eliza's spirit would have heard his desperate cries and returned to him, even if only for a moment. After Eliza's death, James immersed himself in the operation of his several plantations and resumed his commitment to public service. Education was a cause James cared about deeply. He was president of the Board of Visitors of the Virginia Military Institute in Lexington. After studying at the University of Virginia, James served 3 terms in the Virginia House of Delegates, all of which he had spent serving on the Committee of Schools and Colleges. At one public address in Danville in 1853, James acknowledged Virginia's lag behind other states in commerce and industry, and urged as a solution the formation of a state system of public schools equally available to both men and women. In February 1861, Halifax County voted to send James as their representative to Richmond to consider the question of secession. as the United States hurtled toward the brink of civil war. Proponents at the convention believed that states reserved the right to withdraw from the United States at any time. James was criticized for his staunch opposition to the dismemberment of the American Union through secession. Once political momentum had made it clear that secession was inevitable, however, James cautiously agreed to support Virginia's absorption into the Confederacy. His apprehension may have diminished in time. During the war, James would come to invest heavily in the Confederacy, through the purchase of war bonds and cash donations, totaling more than $2 million in today's value. As the war waged on with increasing brutality, preparations were made at Berry Hill in case the Union Army came knocking. The great silver collection was rounded up and buried in the woods for safekeeping. James made it clear to the devoted butler, Alec Pamplin, that he was to burn the mansion if Union troops ever attempted to occupy it. Fortunately for this historic landmark, Union tents were never pitched here, as no major engagements of war took place in these isolated hills. In the final days of March 1865, the end of the Civil War was within sight as Union forces pummeled their way through the Confederate line at Petersburg. At Berry Hill, James Bruce, long resigned to the reality that the power of the Southern aristocracy was about to vanish, was himself also dying. At last, James was reunited with his beloved Eliza and the majority of their children who had preceded them both in death. 4 days later, Richmond had fallen, and within a matter of weeks, the war was over. At the exact same historical moment, the father of Berry Hill was gone, and the nightmare of slavery had come to an end. Barely 20 years old, Berry Hill had already become a relic of the past, one of the last great architectural statements of the antebellum South. The plantation was inherited by James and Eliza's eldest surviving son, Alexander. After the war, none of the newly freed former slaves on the plantation chose to leave, choosing instead to remain at Berry Hill as tenants and work for wages. This may be a testament to how well the former slaves felt they'd been treated by the Bruce family. However, millions of newly freed people across the South chose to remain on plantations as sharecroppers, realizing that they had no money, no literacy, limited skills, and no other home in the world beyond the plantation, which few had ever left. In this way, echoes of the Old South lived on for generations. Freedom did not necessarily equate to opportunity. Alexander Bruce was forced to sell large tracts of the plantation to generate much-needed cash flow, but otherwise managed to operate Berry Hill efficiently through the late 19th century. Sharecropping still ensured bountiful harvests of tobacco and grain, among other crops that flourished in the fertile soil of the Dan River Basin. Realizing he was not able to maintain the mansion's English garden to his late mother Eliza's scrupulous standards, Alexander removed the garden and planted it over with grass. A double row of boxwoods are about the only plantings that remain of the once expansive garden. The Bruces' prosperity and good financial management allowed the family to hang on to their ancestral pile in a time when most of Virginia's old aristocratic families were giving up. Unable to survive in this new socio-economic climate, many plantations throughout the Commonwealth were sold on the cheap to northern investors, or were significantly broken up and divided. The Bruces' financial stability allowed them to still live in grand style. At first glance, relatively little had changed at Berry Hill after the war. Alexander died in 1906, having spent nearly his entire life at Berry Hill. The plantation eventually wound up in the hands of his youngest son, Malcolm, a lawyer who practiced in Washington and Richmond. Berry Hill remained the Bruce family seat, hosting the wedding of Malcolm's sister Ellen in 1909. Malcolm and his wife Myrtle also maintained a posh townhouse on Monument Avenue in Richmond, where, like his grandfather before him, Malcolm's beloved wife was taken from him much too soon. Eventually, Malcolm Bruce remarried. He and his second wife Betty entertained lavishly at Berry Hill throughout the 1920s and 30s. There were luncheons and parties with invitations in the hundreds. Among the set that Malcolm and Betty entertained here were former First Lady Edith Bowling Wilson, the Cranes of Westover, and a breadth of extended family. One cousin, James Cabell Bruce, was a successful banker who would also serve as ambassador to Argentina. Another cousin, David Bruce, was one of the most seasoned diplomats in the Foreign Service and became a respected advisor to a number of presidents. The gentle hum of electric light and indoor plumbing had also come to Berry Hill, although the house largely remained just as Malcolm's grandparents had designed it a century before. Malcolm's wife Betty died in 1943. Yet again, Berry Hill had lost another beloved matriarch well before her time. Malcolm's own time came a few years later. His heirs made the decision to sell Berry Hill, along with many of its contents, including family portraits and more than 2,000 acres of land. Berry Hill was one of Virginia's last plantations still owned by the family who'd built it. After 11 decades, the Bruces, like most of the old Southern aristocracy, had finally given up. Southside native Fred Watkins purchased the house from the Bruce estate in 1950. On his first night in the mansion, Fred awoke to find a mysterious woman watching him while he slept. Alarmed, he leapt from bed and ran from the house, vowing never to stay another night in Berry Hill. Fred Watkins kept his word. He would occasionally open the house for tours, but would never live there after his first terrifying night, choosing instead to occupy his time working the surrounding farmland. Many of the old fields once worked by enslaved people slowly returned to woodland, as they had once been for time immemorial. Fred Watkins hired a caretaker named Cecil Rogers, who lived on the second floor of the mansion. He was a gifted poet and composer of music who found inspiration at Berry Hill. One of Cecil Rogers' most widely circulated poems, called The Ghost of Berry Hill, pays homage to the many spirits here that he had become well acquainted with during his time as caretaker. No, that record will not tell that the doors will slam, that the windows will clatter though tightly jammed, and that something tiptoes up the double stairs like a Persian cat in her high-toned airs. That record will not tell you that while I slept, that a woman came in and raved and wept, hissing and whispering, "Where can he be?" staring, glaring, wild-eyed at me. Oh, I shook and I shivered and covered my face, and begged the intruder to please leave the place. But she stood and stared through her big eyes of brown, then pulled up a chair and sat herself down. She told me a tale that I remember too well. I promised her story I never would tell. Then there came a crash like the breaking of morn. I rolled out of bed, lo, the woman was gone. As fate would have it, Cecil Rogers would be the last African American to live at Berry Hill. After his death in 1967, the mansion once again sat vacant, and as the years passed, had come to look weary with age. It was unclear if there was room for a house like Berry Hill in the fast-approaching new millennium. A sympathetic new owner gave the Virginia Department of Historic Resources permission to visit Berry Hill, and in March of 1991, a team of historians arrived to document the house. Although time had taken its toll on Berry Hill, one of antebellum Virginia's most magnificent homes had hardly been altered since it was built. Original shutters and hardware had been maintained in operable condition, and even the central hall's original 150-year-old floor cloth had simply been carpeted over. The pattern of the present carpet is an exact reproduction of the floor cloth. Berry Hill caught the attention of a French financial services company, who purchased the plantation and invested more than $19 million, transforming the stately home and surrounding property into a lush corporate retreat. Today, Berry Hill is a quiet resort, boasting modern amenities that coalesce with the aura of the past that hangs so heavily over these rolling hills. Relatively little of Berry Hill has changed in the past 180 years. One of Virginia's most outstanding architectural achievements has been a continuous backdrop for the many shades of the human experience that have transpired here. The world that Berry Hill was designed for was a world that, by many metrics, bore stronger resemblance to the distant empires of antiquity than the 21st century. Although that antediluvian world, with its pride and its heartbreak, its oppression and its inequity, its privilege and its confliction, is less different from our own humanity than one might expect.